Welcome to The Kingstonian, a podcast that profiles individuals who are passionate about what they do for a living, about what organization they belong to, or simply passionate about the community they are a part of. Hello there, and welcome. My name is Dave Cunningham. The late ALFRED Bader was one of those benefactors whose donations over the years have helped transform Queen's University, but many of you may not know his story. To help us with that, I've invited the principal of Queen's, Daniel Woolf, to be our guest. Daniel, welcome to the program.
Great to be back.
We are here to talk about the late ALFRED Bader and the influence that he had on the university as well as in the community indirectly. But before I get into that, you are on your countdown to the finishing up of your term as principal of the university.
Yeah.
And I know that you've got all kinds of fun things planned once your term is up. But before you head off, I just want to extend my appreciation on behalf of our listeners to the job that you've done as principal over the last 10 years.
I appreciate that. It's been great fun, and it's a great honor to serve as leader of my alma mater, and I'm very much looking forward to what's going to be achieved by the university under my successor.
And you'll have lots of fun times over the next couple of years as you're taking a lead.
That's right. I get 2 years of administrative leave that I've accrued, and time to catch my breath and get back to being a full-time history professor, at least for the research part. And then in 2 years' time, I'll be back in the Department of History, which was where I started out as an undergraduate 40-odd years ago. So lots to look forward to.
Mm-hmm. Now, let's talk about ALFRED Bader. This is an individual who I've heard about, and he has quite a reputation around campus, but I think there are a lot of people in the community at large who may not know too much about him. So let's talk a little bit about his story and how he came to first be associated with Queen's.
Sure. Well, it's a fascinating story, and because ALFRED has never actually lived in Kingston apart from his time here as a student in the 1940s, it's not surprising that Kingstonians wouldn't necessarily know who he was or the background, but it is a fascinating story. And it began with him growing up as a Jew in Austria in the mid to late 1930s. Just at the point of the Anschluss with Nazi Germany, his family, which actually was an aunt who was raising him, not his biological mother, decided to put him on the Kindertransport out of the new Reich to Britain. So there he went. He was put up by a Mrs. Woolf, different spelling from mine.
No relationship.
No relation at all, though it wouldn't surprise me if her family and my family were acquainted, since it was pretty much the same part of London that my grandparents were living and that my father grew up in. However, war came and enemy aliens, and ALFRED, as a refugee from the Reich, was somewhat perversely deemed to be an enemy alien, and was arrested and deported to what really amounts to being a concentration camp for POWs and political undesirables in Quebec. So
how old would he have been at that
ALFRED
time?
At that point, let's see, was
teenager?
Teenager would have been maybe 16, 17, so 1939, yeah. About that. So he spent, I think, around about a year there, maybe a little less, and then eventually it was decided, well, look, this teenager who, by the way, happens to be Jewish and a refugee from the Reich, doesn't exactly look like a threat to our security. So they released him. He went and stayed with relatives of the lady who had taken him in London. And it was suggested that at that point he actually ought to get a career and get a degree. So as the story goes, he went off to McGill and was told that they had in fact their quota of Jews for the year. There were issues pretty much around the country including Queens, I'm sorry to say, in terms of the numbers of Jews that should be admitted to any university. And McGill told him a flat no. Toronto, I think it was the same story, although there I think it was a little more that it was now sort of late October and the term was already underway. So he then went off to this little place halfway between Toronto and Montreal called Kingston, and apparently showed up at the doorstep of the then highly powerful and influential registrar, Jean Royce. Now, Queen's in those days was probably under 3,000 students. Miss Royce knew pretty much everybody.
Every single
one. And she was the gatekeeper at that point, and she interviewed young Alfred and essentially said, we now have, we can put you into our engineering chemistry program. So he did his degree, thrived academically, did a master's degree here before he went off to Harvard and did a PhD. And then he went off and started his own business.
So he goes to Harvard, get his PhD in chemical engineering or chemistry?
Chemistry. I think it was more basic chemistry by that point, but yeah.
And then he starts a business.
Yeah, he decides to settle in Milwaukee, and he was just sort of randomly picking a place to live, and he starts a business manufacturing research-strength chemicals for businesses, universities, research labs, and so forth. And it seems that was a niche that needed to be filled. He called it Aldrich Chemicals. He had a business partner, and apparently they flipped for who got to name it, and the partner got to name it, and I forgot what Aldrich was, but they became very, very successful. They eventually merged with a larger company, Sigma, and he made his first fortune that way. Then there was a bit of a power struggle on the board, and he got, as sometimes happens, and I can't remember if this was before or after or during the Sigma merge, he got essentially pushed out of the firm. So, cashed out, big deal in terms of the payout because he'd essentially built the firm. Mm-hmm. But not one to rest on his laurels, he then basically set about a second career as an art connoisseur, art buyer, and art vendor with his own collection, which was large but very, very selective, but also as a dealer in art for other people. So, and that became virtually a second career in which he was just as successful.
Where did this art career begin? Do you have a sense of that?
I don't actually know where it began, but I mean, of course, growing up in 1930s Austria, which is of course the interwar period in Austria and Germany, there was a lot going on the score of art, particularly with modernist art, Kandinsky, Paul Klee, and so forth. Alfred's own taste very much veered towards what I would call the early modern period, which is actually, interestingly enough, my period as a historian. So we actually had a lot to talk about. He had a particular interest in Northern European Baroque, Renaissance, and Baroque art, particularly late 16th, 17th century, and also to some degree Southern Baroque art, Italian, and so forth. And when that actually turned from a mild interest into a full-scale, all-consuming passion and second career, basically, I'm not quite sure.
Now, when did he reconnect with Queen's after he had made his fortune in the chemical business?
Well, there's a story about, and I wasn't able to fact check this, but I've heard it several times, that he was one of those famous donors that gave a very, very small gift the first time out, $8 or $10, which, of course, 50 years ago would have been more than it is now. Mm-hmm. But it does illustrate the importance of getting people into the giving habit, even if it's a small amount early on, because it grows. But I don't think he'd ever forgotten how well he'd been treated at Queen's. And I have to say, given everything that he and Isabel and the family have done for the university, even just during the 10 years I've been principal. I give daily thanks for the wise decision of Gene Royce to have admitted him. To me, it's like the brilliant judgment of the 157th publisher that said to J.K. Rowling, boy wizard, I might be able to do something with that. But, yeah.
Okay, so we know that at some particular point, so the story goes that Alfred Bader started contributing a little bit early on back to Queen's after he had gone off and started his first business. Now, in recent years, he has contributed an awful lot to the university. Can you go through some of the things that he has been responsible for?
Oh, sure. I mean, the list is extraordinary. And let me just begin with just the things that he and Isabel and the family foundation that they've set up have done during my 10 years as principal. First of all, the Isabel Bader Performing Arts Center project was conceived by one of my predecessors, Karen Hitchcock, with Dr. Bader, but it didn't really, I think, get fully off the ground till after I got here. And I'll tell you one thing, we found very, very quickly that we didn't have enough money to do the full thing the way it had been conceived. And Alfred, being a very, very parsimonious man, very, very careful with his money. I mean, he would always send checks with in plain brown envelopes by regular post with 3-cent stamps and so forth. Never use a courier.
I read that.
We weren't sure how he was going to take this, and we went to him with a proposal for essentially de-scoping the project a little bit to bring. This was in the wake of I would say a period when perhaps. Capital construction had exceeded funds available, for example, the Queen Center before I arrived. And obviously our board was being very, very careful about what it would actually approve as a building project. So I went to Alfred, and he obviously wanted to know what we were going to get and what he was going to get for an extra donation, but he provided it, and thus the building got going, and we were able to build the fantastic facility that it is. Alfred would, on the spur of the moment, decide that he hadn't done something to honor someone. So, for instance, one day I learned that he had apparently woken up in the middle of the night and realized that he had not done something to honor the memory of Principal Robert Wallace, who had been the principal when he was here as a student. So right away he wrote a check for, I forget what the amount was, to establish a set of international bursaries or scholarships for international refugee students. Again, a very typical Alfred move. Mm-hmm. Showed up one time, decided he wanted to do something to help me out, my role as principal, and I suggested a bunch of things, one or two of which he just wasn't interested in, which was fair enough. But then we hit on the idea of $1 million to the humanities, which tends sometimes not to get the amount of funding, for example, that is available in the STEM disciplines, particularly from the research councils. So he was, with his sympathies in art and art history, he was quite amenable to that. So we established what was called the Bader Postdoctoral Fellows in Humanities, which ran for a couple of years until the funds were spent. But again, you go back before my time, and the list goes on and on. We have a number of endowed chairs in chemistry, in art. We have an endowed Bader curator for the art collection in the Agnes Etherington. We have that fantastic collection of paintings. I mean, how many universities have Rembrandts? How many universities have more Rembrandts than exist elsewhere in the entire country? There are 7 in Canada. We have 4 of them. Not to mention the other art he's donated isn't exactly what I would call second raters either. So it's a just fantastic collection, and the funds to support it through the curator and art conservation and so forth. And then, of course, there's the castle.
Before we go to the castle,
okay.
One point I found interesting when I was reading the article on him in Alumni Review is that it seemed like you had not been principal all that long when he called you. I guess just to test the waters, to see what kind of principal you were going to be?
Well, in fact, it was not that I had not been principal that long, it's that I wasn't even principal yet. I would say the announcement of my appointment was, I think, late January of 2009, and I was still working at the University of Alberta for another 5-6 months. And one day I got an email from Advancement asking if I would take a call from Dr. Bader, and I think this was maybe 3 weeks to a month after my announcement. I said, absolutely happy to. I'd actually always been curious about who this man was, reading about him in the pages of the Alumni Review for decades since I graduated. So we took the call. I took the call, and we had a great chat. I think he was most concerned that I wouldn't put the art up for sale to solve the university's financial challenges.
Mm-hmm. It's an interesting story. It just shows what kind of concern and interest he had in the university, even from Milwaukee.
That's right, and of course, the interest was beyond philanthropy because he was for some time a member of the board of trustees too. So I think I would say his great loves were art, chemistry, certainly Isabel and his family, but also Queens. Mm-hmm. Although he was a very careful and shrewd businessman. He could be impulsive in a good way. I mean, I talked about deciding he needed to do something in memory of a past principal. Well, one day he was out driving in England with Isabel Bader, who's his second wife, and Isabel's family came from Sussex, south of England, and she was familiar with the castle, which dates from the 15th century. And I have to say, as a historian, isn't technically really a castle. It's actually a manor house. It only has half a moat, but we'll leave that aside.
Picky.
We'll leave that aside, but we'll call it the castle. But it is a fascinating building and estate with terrific grounds. Anyway, it happened to be for sale because the Royal Observatory was based there and actually still is, but I think a large part of it was being decommissioned. And so I'm not sure who exactly was selling it. I assume Her Majesty's keepers of the royal grounds or whatever, but it was for sale, and he put in a pitch and bought it. And then apparently the next thing is Principal David Smith, who was the principal at the time, got a call saying that he was being given a castle in England. That must have been one of the most surprising phone calls from a major donor that any university principal or president has ever received.
So what does Queen's do with this castle now?
So for really the last, we got it in 1991 or 1992, and for the last 25, 26 years, we've run a number of programs there. There has been a first-year program, so students can go there and do their entire first year there before they actually come to the Queen's campus. We have students from partner institutions who will do terms there, typically in the upper year, but I think sometimes first year as well. So it's become, I think, kind of our, I call it our Far East campus. It's never made money. But the rumors that it's a big financial sinkhole, I think, have been greatly exaggerated. Mm-hmm. Certainly it took a few years to get on its feet. And, with the rules of accounting, it still has a bit of an accrued debt from those early years. But I think it's had very, very sound management over the last few years. We have a full-time director over there now, Dr. Hugh Horton from the chemistry department, very experienced administrator. He was vice dean and faculty of arts and science for a while. And he's got a very, very good team over there. So it's It's, I think, doing well, and it's a bit like the art. Why would you sell it for a one-time gain? It doesn't actually cost you that much if you look at the proportion, expense. And it gives us some distinction and a foothold in, I was going to say in the European community, but that remains to be, that's a different conversation.
As of this recording, we're not sure where that's going.
Yeah, exactly.
And that was the next point, is that you would think that this would give you that kind of a foothold in that general area and help the university, or at least get the university's name out there.
Yeah, and I think it's helped to a bit. I don't think it's quite reached its potential yet. Queens suffers from a couple of things, one of which is that it's not the only Queens on the planet, whereas there are certain other universities in the country with very distinctive names, with greater name recognition. And
when it comes to looking back on the contribution that he has made to this university, can you encapsulate into a brief description as to what kind of impact Alfred Bader has had on Queens?
We have great support from our alumni, great support from foundations and donors. We had a very successful campaign. We have a number of other major donors. As we do this recording, I'm heading into a weekend of celebrating Mitchell Hall, which is the product of another very generous donor, Bruce Mitchell and his family. We've had Stephen Smith and his gift to Smith School of Business. These are what I would call transformative level donations. All of it assists, from the $10 gift to the $50 million gift. But very few are in the category that they can literally transform a faculty or a university. Alfred Bader is one of the handful of donors, and I've mentioned a couple of others, whose gifts have been simply transformative of the university. They've permitted Queens to do things that the university couldn't possibly have imagined doing, let alone funding adequately. We would not have acquired on our own the art collection, despite the fact that we have an excellent art history department. We would not have been able to build, certainly to the degree it's been a spectacular success, the Isabel Bader Performing Arts Center. We certainly wouldn't have gone on whatever the 1990s equivalent of Kijiji was, looking for a castle to set up in the UK. So these are gifts that genuinely transform the university. But I also don't want to neglect some of the smaller ones. I mean, scholarships, bursaries. Alfred, to the very end, had a real sense of what the university had done for him as a refugee. And he always believed very strongly in giving others a chance. I think some of the happiest moments I've seen him in during the last years of his life was when he actually got to meet some of the refugee students that got support from him and Isabel.
And I think if we bring this all back to the way we opened up the program, is that his contributions has done a lot for the university itself and has made Kingston a community that attracts a lot of people because it has a lot of things that small cities its size don't have, and Queens is one of them.
I think that's absolutely right.
And that's the end of our program. We've run out of time, and I want to thank you very much for taking the time and helping us find out a little bit more about Alfred Bader.
Thanks very much for having me.
Our guest on the program today was Daniel Woolf, sharing his memories of the late Alfred Bader. Theme music for the program is Stasis Oasis, a tune written and performed by Kingston musician Tim Aylesworth. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions about any of our episodes, please send a note to the Kingstonian Podcast Facebook page. This is Dave Cunningham from Kingston, Ontario. Thank you for listening. Until next time.